Hector!
This is the most memorable scene from the 2004 movie Troy.
Hector!
Achilles at the gates.
Hector!
A young Brad Pitt with long blonde hair screaming his head off.
Hector!
Achilles is challenging Hector to a duel in this scene because the latter has killed Patroclus, Achilles' childhood friend and companion. This fight between Hector and Achilles is based on the Iliad, Homer's famous story about the Trojan War, and it is the most iconic example of single combat in the text and the movie. Unlike the movie Troy, the Iliad describes the duel not as a sword fight, but as an exchange of throwing spears. Hector dodges the first spear, but the goddess Athena is helping Achilles and returns his spear to him. His second throw wounds Hector mortally near the collarbone. While the movie differs from the Iliad, the scene still perfectly captures the epic dimension of the mythological conflict. However, it is an earlier scene, right at the beginning of the movie, that arguably depicts the historical nature of single combat much better. Achilles arrives late at the battlefield and is asked to do the king's dirty work, defeating Brouwers, the champion of the other army. This will spare the rest of the men the bloodshed of battle. 2 dodged throwing spears and 1 cinematic jump later, he has defeated his opponent. It is worth noting that Brouwers isn't mentioned in the Iliad, and the movie certainly takes some artistic license. Still, this fight, rather than Achilles' duel with Hector, is how single combat in ancient times might have actually looked like. To quote the historian Stephen Oakley, one obvious function of single combat was to save bloodshed by letting the outcome of a battle be decided by a limited number of contestants. End quote. The fight between Hector and Achilles is motivated by anger and revenge because of Patroclus' death. It is a personal duel, while the fight against Brouwers is motivated by sparing the men the bloody work of battle. This form of warfare is often called champion warfare or single combat. However, the historicity of this mode of combat is highly controversial, and apart from Oakley and a handful of other scholars, many historians regard it with skepticism, and maybe rightfully so. Nonetheless, the small body of research focusing on champion warfare stresses the fact that the image of 2 clashing champions is a phenomenon that appears in many cultures across the globe. From the stories of the Romans of the 3 kingdoms in China, or the Indian epics such as the Mahabharata, to the story of David and Goliath in the Bible, or the narrative of the legendary founder of Rome, Romulus, who defeats his rival Acron. Apart from these historical and legendary examples, single combat still serves an important function in various societies and cultures across the world to this day. For this reason, we investigate this type of warfare, both by looking at the examples in the ancient texts, but also comparing them to modern forms of single combat observed in cultures such as the Brazilian Aimoré, New Zealand's Maori, or the indigenous population of Papua New Guinea. We are fully aware that these comparisons might seem dubious at first glance, but they have also been made by established historians and experts on this topic, such as Hans van Wees. Van Wees' work has been positively reviewed in academic circles. In this video, we want to explore whether single combat has ever existed, how it might have worked, and what we can learn about ancient Greek and Roman societies from this type of warfare. But first imagine for a moment, you could boldly go where no one has gone before. Imagine you weren't born too late to discover the world we live on, and too early to be able to fly to space. Because that's exactly the childhood dream you can live through now with the help of today's sponsor, Star Trek Fleet Command. In this 4X MMO game, you customize your fleet and crew, all while experiencing the Star Trek universe from the pilot seat of powerful ships, such as the USS Enterprise or the Klingon Bird of Prey. You'll need to recruit the iconic characters from the Next Generation, the original series, the J.J. Abrams films, Discovery and more, including Kirk or Spock. It's an open world game, so you'll choose your own path and discover mysteries along the way. The visually stunning graphics really help pull you into the game, and you can try all of this for free because the game is free to play. And moreover, every month new events and content is being added to the game. For example, a new feature, Wave Defense, new officers such as Luther Sloan, Riker and Deanna, as well as 15 new missions were recently added to the game. For me, the easy access to the game and the laid-back gameplay, combined with the Star Trek setting, is what I like best about the game. If this piques your interest, then start fighting space pirates as a commander in the Star Trek universe right now. Click my link in the description below or simply use the QR code on screen to get yourself started. While signing up, use code WARPSPEED to gain in-game rewards. New players get a content pack for free. The pack grants new players 10 epic shards of Kirk. Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus aboris, Italiam fato profugus, Laviniaque venit. I sing of arms and of a man, who first from the coast of Troy, exiled by fate, came to Italy and Levine shores. Goes the opening line of the Aeneid, the Latin poem written by Virgil that shows how Aeneas initiated the foundation of Rome. According to legend, Aeneas fled to Italy after the fall of Troy. Romulus and Remus, who properly founded the city of Rome, are his descendants. This opening illustrates how strongly linked the ancient Roman and Greek cultures really were, and makes clear how important warrior culture was to the ancient Romans. Glory gained and bravery displayed in battle were highly sought after qualities in Rome. The Greek writer Polybius, when describing the Roman military, explains, quote, "Young Roman men are thus inspired to endure every suffering for public welfare, in the hope of winning glory that attends on brave men. What I say is confirmed by the facts, for many Romans have voluntarily engaged in single combat in order to decide a battle. Not a few have faced certain death, some in war to save the lives of the rest, and others in peace to save the Republic." End quote. Polybius puts single combat into the context of bravery, glory, and saving the Republic. He even says it decided the outcome of entire battles. Under the common assumption that the function of single combat was to limit bloodshed, this seems to make a lot of sense. But there are two problems. Firstly, why would one of the most successful armies of the ancient world let their battles be decided in such a hazardous way? Secondly, if we examine the available primary sources about single combat, we find that, quote, "If one leaves aside poetic fantasy, there are no examples, apart from the mythical stories, in which the outcome of an ancient Roman battle depended upon the outcome of a duel." End quote. If battles took place despite single combats, its main function could not have been to save bloodshed. One might be tempted to think that they were just made up as a part of the narrative, but this doesn't seem to be the case. Stephen Oakley found that, quote, "single combat was far more common at Rome than has been generally realized, and that, quote, though the evidence is not decisive, a coherent argument can be constructed to support the view that in the Middle Republic, at least, single combats occurred each year." End quote. So, if single combats did happen, but they were no means to save the armies from bloodshed, what were they, really? Stephen Oakley defines single combat as, quote, "those formal situations in which a champion from one army challenges one of the opponents to a duel, and in which the two armies are not normally engaged in fighting at the time and thus watch the spectacle." End quote. He explains that these situations can be formal, so the armies meet and let their champions fight, similar to Achilles versus Boagrius or Paris versus Menelaus in the movie Troy. But they could also happen more spontaneously during combat when heroes sought each other out during battle. This is also portrayed in Troy when Hector fights Ajax. Single combat, however, is by no means limited to ancient Greek and Roman epic poetry. In fact, and I quote, "this practice is in no way confined to the Mediterranean basin or to the Middle East, whence it is most familiar to classical and biblical scholars, but is found all over the world." End quote. The most famous single combat in the Bible is of course the fight between David and Goliath. The structure of this narrative helps us to understand single combat. First, the armies face each other. Goliath makes his challenge to single combat. David volunteers to fight Goliath. David defeats Goliath using his sling. The Philistines leave the battlefield. David becomes popular in Israel. Saul, the king, first is angry at him, but later makes peace with David and recognizes David as his successor. So there are three important narrative elements. Firstly, the stronger champion challenges the weaker fighter. Secondly, the fight is won by the seemingly inferior fighter. And thirdly, the victor's status increases dramatically. This pattern can be observed in several other cultures. The Aimoré people in Brazil, for example, settle their border issues with champion combat. Competing and winning in such a fight is very prestigious, so much so that a successful champion often becomes the chief or headman of the community. Among the Maori of New Zealand, it often used to happen that a warrior would step forward when two armies met, challenged another man to a duel, and if he won, continued to fight other contestants in single combat. Although this procedure was slightly different, the result was the same. The side with the defeated champions would retreat without engaging in battle. Maori champions gained great repute through such fights, and champions of opposing groups would often seek each other out. Similar examples are reported from the Tlingit peoples. Ancient sources mention such fights among the Celts, and they're also a prominent feature in Irish sagas. The pattern, not always, but very often is the same. First challenge, second fight, third gain in status. So it is fair to say that single combat is common and does happen. Regarding ancient times, it is reported frequently too, even up to the time of the first Emperor Augustus. But only for the ancient Romans, not for the Greeks. While there are many single combats in the Homeric epics, none are reported after about 500 BC, when the classical period in Greece begins. To quote Stephen Oakley once more, quote, "In the 5th and 4th century, there is no evidence of single combat in Greece." This raises the question why single combat continued to be a feature in warfare in ancient Rome, but not in Greece. The wrath, Sing, goddess of Peleus' son Achilles, that destructive wrath which brought countless woes upon the Achaeans. This is the beginning of the Iliad, the story about Achilles' wrath. The central theme of the poem is the importance of being angry, as the historian Hans van Wees put it. Anger in the world of epic poems is usually the result of an insult to honor, timē in ancient Greek. For example, the Trojan War itself was caused because Menelaus lost his honor as a husband when his wife Helena was stolen. After such an insult, honor had to be restored by any means, and single combat was a good way to do so. So let's look at how these duels were conducted in the Iliad. The historian Hans van Wees found that the battles of the Trojan War were usually neither fought in big formations like the later phalanges, nor simply one man against the other. However, the Iliad occasionally mentions that the Greeks fought close to each other, and some scholars have labeled warfare in the Iliad as some type of shield wall warfare. As with many things regarding Homer and the Iliad, controversies are the norm. If you want to get a full picture, we suggest the new companion to Homer. Regarding Homeric warfare, it is worth noting that the actual descriptions of battles in the Iliad give the impression that the armies stood apart from each other, not close to each other. So leaving considerable space between them in which only a few men at a time would actually engage in combat. These men are called promakoi, which translates to warriors that fight in the front. When Paris walks in front of his army during battle, for example, Menelaus sees him, jumps down from his chariot, quote, making an appearance among the frontline warriors, end quote. Paris immediately retreats into the mass of men, and Hector steps forward to propose a truce, but is shot at by the Greeks immediately. This is quite similar to how the battles were fought between the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea or the Maori. And just like the earlier mentioned fight between Achilles and Brouwers, another central feature of Homeric warfare seems to be the use of missile weapons. The same goes for the duel between Hector and Achilles in the Iliad, which is solely conducted with throwing spears. Hector does draw his sword, but he is struck down before even reaching Achilles. According to Hans van Wees, this was the norm, quote, "These frontline warriors are highly mobile, moving back and forth, in and out of the fight, which is mostly conducted by throwing spears, though occasionally a man moves in close enough to deliver a blow with a spear or sword. There is even enough space for the odd chariot to maneuver among the men. Massed hand-to-hand combat, it is not." End quote. The use of throwing spears and darting back and forth is also reminiscent of how the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea fight. This is not to say that they are exactly alike, but it becomes clear that Homeric warfare differed fundamentally from how the Greeks fought later, The reason for that is probably that the Iliad reflects a period in the Dark Ages or the early Archaic period. Some scholars even date the Trojan War back to the Bronze Age, but that is not consensus anymore. In the classical period, the Greeks relied on the hoplite phalanx, which was a formation that relied heavily on group cooperation. It is often argued that the men were no longer incentivized to engage in a duel, but to stay in formation and hold the line, which is nicely captured by this scene in the fantasy movie 300. But again, everything regarding the hoplite phalanx is somewhat controversial. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, Joshua Brouwers' article in the Ancient World magazine nicely summarizes the current state of research and explains common fallacies surrounding Greek warfare. Whatever the reason may be for the decline, there are simply no more single combats in Greece in the 4th and 5th century if Stephen Oakley is to be trusted. In Rome, however, they continued to exist for another few hundred years. A probable explanation is offered by the earlier quote by Polybius. He explains, quote, "The Romans endured every suffering for public welfare, in the hope of winning glory," end quote. Polybius hits the mark. While Roman legions are known for their discipline, Roman politics, quote, demanded that aspiring leaders prove themselves to be valiant warriors, and to fight in single combat was one way in which this might be done, end quote. In Rome, the notion of virtus was of utmost importance. Virtus literally means manliness. It has connotations of valor, masculinity, excellence, and courage, all perceived as masculine strengths. In Rome, an aspiring aristocrat needed to prove his masculine strengths to gain followers who would support him in politics. In exchange, the aristocrat would look out for them and guarantee their interests. For example, that they received their salaries or retirement payments if they were soldiers. This, at least in part, is why Romans fought Romans in the civil wars. They were bound to their generals who protected their interests in the Republic. So, in this interpretation, gaining glory was so important to politics that single combat as a means to gain status remained common in Rome, while it ceased to exist in Greece. This view is supported by the fact that single combat became much less frequent in Rome once Augustus, the first Roman emperor, rose to power. It is usually thought that he monopolized glory and status in a single person, disincentivizing others to try to gain valor and glory on the battlefield. In this view, they could no longer gain significant political backing, because the power lay with the emperor anyways. So, taking the risk of single combat was not as attractive anymore. In any case, please be aware that this is a hypothesis, not a conclusive remark. As mentioned before, there is much debate surrounding this topic. Therefore, we suggest you look at the literature yourselves and make up your own opinion. A special shout out to all our patrons. Thanks for the continuous support. And also thanks to everybody for watching.